Welcome everyone to the Institute for Public Knowledge. My name is Eric Kleinenberg. I am the director here, also on the faculty of sociology at NYU. For those of you who are new, IPK is a university-wide institute. We do all kinds of research projects and public events that we think are going to have significance beyond the classroom. So we really try to reach out and engage with the many communities we're embedded in. We do projects on things like the future of democracy, climate change, the future of work. So we're feeling a lot of pressure here these days, and we're especially happy that you are around. One of our favorite things to do is to invite authors who've got important new books to come and participate in conversations with terrific people we have around New York. And full disclosure, I'm a Carlo Rotella groupie. I've always been a huge fan and admirer of the way he does the craft. He's a scholar, he's a professor of American Studies, teaches literature. He's also an extraordinary journalist. He writes these brilliant profiles in the New York Times Magazine, in the New Yorker. He still plays basketball, and he's just kind of a good person to hang out with. I have on this bio of him all the awards that he's won, and I'm not going to name them. I'll tell you that he wrote a book about South Shore neighborhood in Chicago. It's been in the news a lot recently because there was a big ice raid there that you might have read about. Had a conversation about that book a few years ago. His new book, which I have in my hand, and you could have in your hand soon too, is called What Can I Get Out of This? Teaching and Learning in a Classroom Full of Skeptics. I got started reading it a few days ago. It's an amazing book. You're about to hear a lot about it. Carlo's teaching first-year students at Boston College during COVID, and got to learn a little bit more about those students and their lives and their worlds and the things they're concerned about than you might ordinarily, and decided not to stop at the end of the class, but to follow them and to learn, what happens when you study, come to college. And he made this amazing point, and I don't want to steal your thunder. Come out into lots of space. Feel free to move up. It'll be better for us. He made this, thank you. Oh my God, terrific. Sit in the first row, you get bonus points. Get 10% off your books if you sit in the first row. That in some ways, all of us in the university recently have been talking about AI and how hard it is to teach because we're worried about what students are going to do with AI. Students are worried about what we're going to do with AI, but he also made this amazing point, which maybe you'll elaborate on later, that probably at no time in our careers as professors have we spent so much time talking about what happens in the classroom, what good teaching is, what it means to have a good assignment, right? What is the university really for? And it's that kind of creative thinking, I think, that makes Carlo's work so compelling. So we have this book here. We always like to say at IPK that all of our events are free, open to everyone. If you're an NYU student, it's about $90,000, but otherwise it's free. And the one thing that we like to ask is that if you're here, you help the bookseller. Come on in, there's lots of space up in the front. I'm offering bonuses for anybody who sits in the first row. I think after the event, Carlo's going to sit around and do some book signing also. You can participate in that. All right, so one of the fun things we like to do here is bring really sharp people who bring different perspectives to our conversation. So Carlo's going to talk for about 25-30 minutes about his book, and then we have two distinguished speakers who just make a few comments before we open it up for discussion. The first is Leonard Cassuto, who's a professor of English at Fordham, also an award-winning journalist. He writes about science, he writes about sports. He doesn't play basketball, but he does play squash, which is a very demanding game, I can tell you, because I got injured this week trying. He is the author of an editor of 10 books, including The New PhD, How to Build a Better Graduate Education, Graduate School Mess, What Caused It and How We Can Fix It, and Academic Writing as Readers Matter. So we find a more suitable person for this conversation. And then we have an IPK fellow and regular LaRue, Lewis-McCoy, who's a professor here in the Sociology of Education program in the Department of Applied Statistics, Social Science, and Humanities. Steinhardt. I wish we had an easier way to say that.
Yeah.
Great sociologist teaching at NYU. His central line of research is about educational inequality. He's written terrific book called Inequality in the Promised Land, Race, Resources, and Suburban Schooling. He just came back from a year at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, so he's fresh and full of great, brilliant ideas, albeit not with Albert Einstein hair, a very attractive beard. So anyway, they'll come up afterwards, then we'll open up for discussion. Carlo, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks to the IPK and Mike Consowicz for putting this together, and thanks to Leonard, to Lenny and LaRue for agreeing to talk about the book, and thanks to all of you for coming. I wrote a book about what happens in the classroom, so it's not only a book about what happens between student and teacher and between student and student, but also about what happens inside everyone's minds. The classroom in question is Stokes Hall South 209 on the campus of Boston College, and the class is my section, of course, known at BC as Lit Core. There's at least a couple people in here who've taken that. A required literature course that almost every freshman has to take, in most cases their first and last college level literature course. Semester in question is spring of 2020, which started out as just another semester, but was transformed by the COVID pandemic in ways that obliged us to think hard about the value of school in general and face-to-face learning and teaching in the classroom in particular. So that's what the book is about, what happens in the classroom, what it means, what it might be worth. So in a bit, I'm going to read a passage, and then we're going to hear from them, and then Mulhern, you're late.
Thank you.
And then we can talk about it. But first, I just thought I'd frame the book for you a little. And one way to do that is to offer some answers to a basic question, which is, why did you write a book about what happens in the classroom? So, answer number one. The classroom, and the college classroom in particular, is a black box in our culture. There's no lack of strong opinions about what happens or doesn't happen there. But most of us tend to avoid the details. Consider what happens as an extreme but actually pretty typical example when Hollywood encounters a college classroom. Usually after no more than a few seconds, there's a fight, a chase, a nightmarish display of professorial oversharing, or some other spectacular interruption of business as usual, as if sitting there and watching teaching and learning take place is an unendurable horror. Take the movie Arrival. It's known as a thoughtful movie about smart people, and the main character is a professor. But when the movie tries to show a college class, it panics after only a few seconds and has space aliens invade. So the students and their professor end up watching the alien invasion on TV in class instead of having class. The lesson here is clear. Watching people watch screens with their mouths hanging open is fine, even thrilling. But watching people teach and learn is to be avoided at all costs. Our popular culture, like our political culture and Congress, is not that different from Hollywood on this score. Shuns the classroom like a hydrophobic raccoon avoids suburban swimming pools. And yet, many people who don't spend any time in classrooms are very sure that they know what's going on there, and that terrible things are happening. From lowered standards and participation trophies for everyone, to ideological indoctrination, to failure to provide return on investment or prepare young people for careers. So I thought it would be useful to open the black box and show some humans doing the humanities. I have at least 3 more answers to why did you write this book. Answer number 2, and Eric alluded to this one already, the face-to-face classroom is getting more, not less, cutting edge. Every supposedly game-changing tech advance that affects education tends to make face-to-face teaching and learning rarer and more valuable. Zoom was the big new thing in spring 2020, and massive open online courses were the big new ed tech thing before Zoom. Remember when MOOCs were going to disrupt and revolutionize education? And since Zoom, AI has now thrown scholars into a fresh round of revising their habits, with many deciding to concentrate less on papers and more on what happens in class, backed up by old-fashioned blue book or oral exams. So, like Zoom and MOOCs before it, AI has made us freshly aware of the unique value of the face-to-face classroom and inspired at least some teachers to make the humanities more human and more humane in response. That includes finally getting around to banning screens in their classrooms, which all by itself makes an enormous difference. All the booster talk about wondrous educational applications of emergent technology raises queasy-making echoes for me of Woodrow Wilson exclaiming, "They teach history with lightning," in response to seeing the birth of a nation. And the fact is that during the pandemic, parents were rightly not okay with the prospect of paying full freight for super high-tech online gadget college. It's not the same thing as the face-to-face coming. Answer number 3. What happens in the literature classroom is important. That's where students develop and practice a fundamental competence that they will need no matter what they end up doing for a living. Extracting meaning from the world and making arguments in support of that interpretation. The skills involved include some that are in worrisomely short supply in our culture these days, in ways that endanger the functioning of democracy. Assessing the relative reliability of what you read and see and hear, for instance, or developing empathy for others. In putting these tools in our toolboxes, we're pursuing both of the basic missions of the humanities. There are 2 main positions in a long-running internal debate among humanists about the value of the humanities. One side sees the principal value of the humanities in teaching lessons about how to live. The topic of my section of Lit Corps was the misfit. All books were about social misfits, so there were lessons aplenty in how and how not to live. The other side in the long-running debate sees the principal value of the humanities in the acquisition of equipment for living in the form of analytical skills, often described as critical thinking. Though it's been going on for centuries, it's actually not a very compelling debate, since there's an obvious both-and, not either-or, solution to the problem it purports to address, just like the contrived standoff between taste great and less filling. So, Miller Lighthead. If you're looking for lessons in how to live, you have to work on your analytical chops so that you can get meaning out of all kinds of artifacts in which those lessons might be found. And if you're looking for lessons in analytical chopsmanship, then you need some kind of application to the problem of how to live to impart the necessary urgency of a meaningful answer to the so what question. So, taste great and less filling, pretty obviously. How we extract meaning from and impose meaning on the world around us is a subject you should encounter at some point in your time on campus, even if you don't want to. Making it difficult to duck this encounter is part of the value of Lit Corps and of the distribution requirements of a core curriculum that obliges students to at least dip a toe in many disciplines. Though it has long been true that there's not much difference in lifetime earnings among the different majors, a well-kept secret. Students, egged on by their parents, would often rather be using college to prepare intensively for a particular career, like training full-time in a sport as preparation for playing that sport professionally. But they will graduate into a working world where the games and the rules keep changing at ever more dizzying speeds. A more accurate athletic analogy for the entry-level labor market, instead of majoring in baseball in school and then playing baseball for a living, would be they want you to play dodgeball with bales of data one day and then ballroom dance with clients the next. So students need to train to be all-around athletes, ready for everything and anything. The sudden but uneven intrusion of AI into nearly every industry has made the weakness of the crude vocational approach to college even more abundantly clear. As finance and computer science majors are just now finding out, the rise of AI has made it much harder to time the entry-level labor market 4 or 3 or even 2 years out from picking a major, which is just another reason to ignore anybody telling you that you have to pick a major that has the same name as the job you want to get. The opposite strategy would be to pick a major that allows you to go deep on what interests you, while also getting yourself a nice, well-rounded liberal arts education, heavy on meta skills like adaptability, being good at learning fast, and being hard to fool. And let's not forget, even though approximately 100% of commentators on higher ed do forget, that the liberal arts include math and science and music. Finally, answer number 4. I wanted to write about literature and about school in ways that do justice to the experience of people. Most writing about these subjects feels too abstract to me. The people's encounter with school and with literature is the opposite of that. It's immediate, it's full of feeling, it's often sweaty and uncomfortable. So I wanted to write a book about school and about the study of literature that was full of how humans feel. Those are some of my reasons for writing the book. Here's just a quick word on how I wrote it. To properly tell the story of one class over one eventful semester and explore its bigger picture implications, I had to get into students' heads. To do that, I employed a technique that, as far as I can tell, has rarely been used by people who have strong opinions about college, especially people who write the kind of Jeremiah ads that achieve notoriety by complaining that students these days can't write, won't read, and are closed-minded sheep. I asked students what they were thinking. More people who have public things to say about higher education should try it. It turns out that there's a lot going on in students' heads, some of it even related to class. Okay, some basic details. There were 32 freshmen and 1 sophomore in the class, 17 women, 16 men. And there was also a teaching assistant, a super capable MA student named Allie. I changed all the students' names in the book. They actually all gave me permission to use their real names, but they were way too forthcoming about their families and what they did at night, and so I changed it. Most of the students were heading for business or STEM majors and did not regard English as a strength or a main interest. And many of them started out somewhat to very skeptical about the whole enterprise of interpreting literature. A significant proportion, including some who had gotten good grades in English in high school, but had still looked with suspicion on classmates who talked a lot in those classes, tended to regard the interpretation of literature as either sorcery or bullshit. So part of my job as a teacher of a required freshman literature class was to show them that this kind of analysis is a craft you can learn and master, like building a cabin or planting a garden. That was part of moving them from their initial reaction to lit core, which was usually, can I get out of this, to adding one more word to the question, right? What can I get out of this? Starting about 15 months after the class ended, I interviewed almost all the students in their junior and senior years. Everybody had an hour-long interview to start with, and then I invited several students back for more interviews. I got to know some of them better because they took other classes with me, and I started correspondences with some of them, and some of those continue to this day. The chapters shift back and forth between diving deep into individual students' minds and telling the story of the semester, which starts out like any other until the pandemic comes along halfway through to remind us that face-to-face learning and teaching is a precious thing that can be taken away from us. There are chapters devoted to topics like unreliable narrators. Donald Trump was president in the spring of 2020. The prevalence on campus of anxiety, loneliness, and feeling like a misfit. The importance and difficulty of speaking up in class. Learning to college in the way that people in prison talk about learning to jail. How to get into a book you hate, and in fact how to use your violent reaction against a book as a way into it. How to strike the crucial educational balance between getting with the program and taking just what you need, and the vital importance of anteing up and becoming a participating citizen in the community of inquiry that forms the classroom, which is among the most vital meta skills to learn in discussion-based science. So I'm going to give you a taste of the book, and I'm going to read from a chapter entitled Speaking Up, and then we'll hear from Lenny and Baru. So I don't think you need to know much more about, I'm just going to read bits and pieces of this chapter, but I think they'll hang together. I don't think you need to know much more other than I have a policy in my classes that you have to hear from everybody at every class meeting. So there's an obligation to speak at these classes, which my interviews made clear made people very nervous, but it also made them do the reading, right? So it's sort of a trade-off. This is from the chapter called Speaking Up. Colleen and Kathy weren't speaking up in class. They had each taken their turn to introduce themselves during the first day ice-breaking ritual, but that jumpstart had not led to their consistently volunteering to speak in subsequent class meetings. Neither Colleen, who usually sat halfway back to my right, nor Kathy, who usually sat near the back to my left, displayed the seethingly slack affect of somebody who believes she's in the wrong place and is counting the seconds until she can get the hell out of there. Rather, they usually looked engaged, paying attention, taking notes, and at times I thought to detect on each of their faces the alert and slightly pained look of someone who has things to say and isn't saying them. When I first started teaching, my attitude towards students who remained silent in discussion classes could be summed up with the words of Bernard Hopkins, the fistic sage of Philadelphia. Bernard Hopkins going to do what was going to do. If students didn't want to talk, it was on them. They were free to choose not to speak and would have to accept the lower grade that came as a consequence. After all, I had not talked much in class when I was a student, and I had resisted professors who tried to make me talk. But though I still regard the Hopkins Credo as words to live by, I've learned the error of my ways when it comes to applying it to silent students. Silence is usually not their preferred state, and indeed was not my preferred state when I was one of them. I had things to say, and it bothered me that I often couldn't make myself say them. Trying to help silent students find a way into the conversation and thus into full citizenship in the classroom turns out to be no big effort for a teacher, and the results can be life-changing for the student. It also benefits the teacher because the quietly contagious excitement of previously stymied students who finally found a way to speak up improves classroom chemistry, and nothing makes teaching and learning easier or more joyful than good classroom chemistry. A classroom in which everyone there has anteed up as a participant is a much better, more effective, more dynamic, more transformative classroom than one in which some people are holding back from being full participants in our communal inquiry. Typically, silent students are just a little more worried than others about saying something wrong or irrelevant or incoherent or just plain stupid that will produce the long, awkward silence they fear most of all. Or maybe they find it a little harder than others to time the flow of give and take so that they can jump in at the right moment with a relevant comment. Or they might be hit a little harder than others by the alienating effect of imposter syndrome, homesickness, or skepticism about literary interpretation, any of which might make others' apparent ease of entry into our discussion seem especially forbidding. Whatever the reasons for silent students' silence, it's a problem that I can and should address with them. In keeping with the bedrock principle that you must go and get an education rather than wait passively for someone to hand it to you. I should have gotten to Kathy and Colleen much sooner in the semester than I did, but it was a big class and it took me too long to notice that they were straggling. Still, before we got any deeper into the semester, I asked Kathy and then Colleen to come to my office during office hours to meet with me one-on-one. There is an expectation that we hear from you in class, I wrote in an email to each of them, intentionally avoiding the first person to avoid making it seem as if I was personally expecting them to talk. I wanted rather to strike a dispassionate and procedural note, more like this is how this class is properly done. Form expresses meaning, even in an email. I wrote, if you are having trouble finding your way into the conversation, let's figure out a strategy that works for you. Finding out more about them, both in these meetings and in subsequent conversations with each of them that continued well past the end of the semester, dispelled the illusion of sameness generated by the opacity of silence. Silent students may have their silence in common, but the distinctive quality of each one's silence conceals depth of individuality. They may not be talking, and they may not always be thinking about what I want them to think about, but they are thinking, which means that if I consider myself any kind of pro at all, I should try to figure out a way to reach them. I started with Kathy. As she told me later when I interviewed her, she's from Greenwich, Connecticut, and attended a small private academy abundantly endowed with capital, posh tiger moms, and expectations of moving on to a suitably exclusive college. There were no boys in her classes until the 9th grade, and she didn't adjust well to the change. She had spoken up in middle school where classes had been small and she felt comfortable among girls she knew well. This is a quote from her. But as the years went on and we started being mixed with our brother's school, I kind of didn't know how to act around boys. She clammed up, and it didn't help that she didn't get along with her English teacher. She just didn't like me for some reason, she said. Maybe it's because I was a bit of a jokester, but nothing, malicious, and I also have ADD, and maybe that might have distracted the class at times. She kind of set a bad tone for my English experience, especially because I had her twice. As a freshman in college, she said, I was like this anxious little ball, not wanting to, scared of doing like one wrong thing, antsy, just finding my place in college. She actually had a strong crew in Lit Corps, her best pal Charlotte, and also Liz and Bill, 2 more members of her recently formed friend group. And they all encouraged each other. I was so tortured, I'd be like, you can say something to Charlotte. She's like, no, you say it. Like, I'm not saying that. We were all like, all right, you're going to say something in this class. Her friends found ways to speak up, and Bill in particular became a regular contributor. But she sat there rehearsing things she could say and then not saying them. She had formed the erroneous impression that there were several upperclassmen in the room. There was just one, myself, which she allowed to intimidate her And, she said, there were a lot of boys, specifically hockey boys. There were, I agreed, an unusual number of male students in that class who, like her friend Bill, felt comfortable talking about literature. And it couldn't have helped that one of what she called the hockey boys took the lead as a participatory icebreaker at the beginning of the semester. Wilson, yes, I know, said Kathy, looking back at her terrified freshman self, as if to say, you see what I was dealing with? I get to college and there are serious business hockey boys who are going on to the Olympics and the NHL. And on top of that, they turn out to be suave literary sophisticates too. When Kathy came to see me at office hours, I proposed a plan that would lower the bar to participation for her. At the next class meeting, we decided she would know the opening question in advance, which would allow her to prepare an answer. She would put up her hand and I would call on her right away. Going first would prevent her from building up a disabling head of anticipation and dread as the class meeting went on. It would also eliminate any need to worry about being preempted by someone else or timing and adjusting her comment to fit into the flow of conversation. On the evening before our next class meeting, I sent an email to all the students reminding them to come to class prepared with a passage from chapter 2 of Junot Diaz's The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. We were reading them. And at least the beginning of a thought about why that passage matters. When we got down to business in class the next day, Kathy put up her hand. I called on her, and she said something on point about a passage she'd chosen. Neither she nor I recalls what it was, but let's say it was about how Lola's mother, Bailey, is pushing just as hard for her actively rebellious daughter to be a regular girl as everybody seems to be pushing Bailey's passively dissenting son, Oscar, to be a regular guy. When a student who doesn't normally talk says something, I want, without making an embarrassing fuss, to make extra sure to reinforce the contribution by noting its usefulness. So I said something like, okay, that gets us off to a good start. Kathy's pointing out how in this novel, the business of enforcing norms is not just about dictators and men. Now we also have a mom and daughter pair, which looks like a more complicated pattern starting to form. Who would like to go next? So Kathy had spoken in class and lived to tell about it. She had not babbled meaningless nonsense that caused a dark abyss of embarrassed silence to yawn open after she spoke. She had not been struck down by apoplexy or lightning or subjected to gales of mocking laughter from distorted faces out of a nightmare. She looked like she felt pretty good about it. In fact, she felt so good that 20 minutes later she put up her hand again. I try to call on students in reverse order of how often they raise their hand, so when a student who rarely talks puts up her hand, I go right to her. Kathy made a second point, this one building on something someone else had just said. Even if she had prepared the second point in advance, she'd still had to find an opportune moment to slide it into the conversation, another big step for her. Restraining an urge to dart across the room to high-five her, I again underscored that she'd contributed to our collective effort, something on the order of, so Kathy's pointing us to the importance of X, which we can put together with what Dala was saying about Y and David said about Z, and that's starting to look like a clear set of connections between form and theme. That helps us to see how temporarily shifting the narrator to Lola does meaningful work. Part of my job is to show students that they're participating as full citizens in an ongoing project, our crafting of interpretive arguments about the meanings that flow through a text. And one way I can do that is to recognize and reinforce such participation when it happens. See this thing Kathy has done. She has brought us thick pelts and succulent tubers from beyond the river so that we may enjoy full stomachs and cozy warmth. Truly, she is a contributing member of our clan. These are my words. I have spoken. I'll just do a little bit on Colleen. So Colleen was next. Like Kathy, she was a white suburbanite who'd grown up outside New York City and attended an all-girls school, Catholic in Colleen's case, and single-sex all the way through the end of high school. But the superficial resemblance ended there. Kathy, the daughter of a BC alum who worked in private equity and a mother who devoted herself to medical charity, had grown up in an exclusive town synonymous with insulated suburban privilege in a big house so full of pets that her family called it the zoo. She had attended a school that specialized in sending its graduates on to elite colleges. By contrast, Colleen, an only child, was a first-generation college student, daughter of a maintenance man and a secretary in a doctor's office at a hospital in the Bronx. She'd been just about the only one of her schoolmates who left the environs of New York City and went away to college, a few hours north in exotic Boston. And she had applied to BC despite being assured by her school's guidance counselor that she had no chance to get in. All 4 of Colleen's grandparents had been immigrants from Ireland to the Bronx. She'd grown up just to the north of the Bronx in an apartment in a small housing complex in Yonkers, which may be technically a suburb of New York City, but feels more like a mid-sized mill city, bigger than any city in New England except Boston, in fact, and with an urban mix of Irish, Italian, Latino, and Black population. Colleen had spent summers in the Bronx with a grandmother in her mother's old neighborhood around Webster Avenue and Gun Hill Road, which Colleen described to me as kind of rough, her pale, serious face coloring with a deep blush at the thought that I might erroneously understand her to be trying to claim some kind of street cred. Unlike Kathy, Colleen knew exactly what she had to do with her life. She had wanted to be an elementary school teacher for as long as she could remember, and she would be majoring in elementary education and applied psychology in BC School of Education. She believed that school is where people can equip themselves to move up and make good in the world, and she wanted to help kids do that. She applied only to colleges and universities with strong education programs, 10 of them, as many as could fit on the FAFSA form. Even with robust aid, college was a big stretch for her family, and as an only child, she was acutely aware that her working-class parents made sacrifices for her and were counting on her to move up and prosper. When I asked Colleen if she felt that a lot was riding on whether she spoke up and did well in Lickport and at BC, she said, yeah, well, everything, really. It means everything to me and to my family as well. Beyond the money, there was the expectation, the looming sense of high stakes. My dad, he doesn't say much. He's kind of a tough guy. But I bought him a BC cap, and he wears it all the time. Like, that's his way of saying, oh my God, I'm so proud of her. And then my mom, she always tells me she was never a good student, but anytime I'll call her, like the other day, I was complaining about housing, and she was like, all right, I'm on it, I'm gonna check it out. So knowing that she would do anything to help me further my college career, they're incredibly proud of me. And I'm incredibly proud to be their daughter and to be getting a college education. And of course, speaking up wasn't just expected in my class, and it wasn't just part of how a student does well in college. It's what teachers do. If Colleen couldn't talk in class, how was she going to become a teacher? Like Kathy, Colleen did the reading and respected and envied other students who seemed to be able to talk with no discomfort. But also like Kathy, she couldn't get herself across the barrier between silence and speaking. She was a lifelong reader, starting from a childhood taste for fantasy that hit the usual marks: Aaron Hunter's Warrior Cats, Percy Jackson, Harry Potter. She loved books, she knew how to get into them, she wasn't overly skeptical about interpretation, and she had things to say. But as she described her freshman self's thought process, I think I just get in my head too much, and I'll be practicing what I want to say if I have an idea, but then I'm just worried that it will sound like not knowing what I'm talking about, the wrong thing. And of course, like many others in the room, but with an extra shot of class anxiety that made the heart race and the sweat flow even faster, she worried that everyone else had gone to high-powered high schools, where they learned exactly the right thing to say and could say it effortlessly under color. So I set up the same kind of plan with Colleen that I had with Kathy. I'll give you the first question in advance, you prepare something, I'll call on you first, we'll rip the Band-Aid right off. We were still discussing the brief, wondrous life of Oscar Wilde, and I asked everyone to concentrate on a 4-page passage late in the novel in which several of its most vivid recurring images, the mysterious golden mongoose, sinister faceless man, repeated instances of spoken or written language reduced to unreadable blanks, all show up in proximity to each other. I called on Colleen when she raised her hand in response to my first question, which I had shared with the class in advance. She observed that the faceless man and Paquinas and Blanco were both images of something that we, the reader, the character, the narrator, can't read or don't want to read or are afraid to read. Beautiful. I did my reinforcing due diligence by saying to the class that Colleen's getting us started by pointing out a meaningful connection between 2 recurring images that each can seem kind of opaque by itself. And we went on from there. When I interviewed Colleen in her junior year, I asked her what had changed for her that allowed her to speak up in mid-court. I thought about that a lot, she said. It was such a turning point, just that spring semester, from the beginning to the end. Fall semester, I was incredibly homesick, even though I'm only 3 hours away. So then spring semester, I was like, okay, you know what? College is short, I'm going to enjoy it, and home's not going anywhere. So I was like, all right, great, I'm so happy to be back in BC, I'm going to have a good time. That mindset was just beginning to take solid shape when she got the email from me reminding her that she was expected to contribute to the class. Already thinking like a teacher in training, looking to pick up craft from her own teachers, she said, that was just a huge takeaway, really looking out for your students, seeing them as their own person. And then I had the conversation with you about participation, and I was like, okay, great, I'm going to push myself. Colleen started raising her hand in lit core classes, not a lot, but consistently enough to create a new habit, to replace her previous one of swallowing her ideas unsaid. When she pushed herself to do this one thing, she found it easier to push herself to talk in other classes. And other dominoes also fell. She said, looking back now, I think I've grown in every way, like academically, socially, even emotionally. In my own friendships, sometimes I struggle with being quiet. So now I try to say, okay, well maybe I'll just start the conversation and then the other person will keep going. And instead of being like, oh, I have nothing to say, well, at least I'll get them talking. It's like participating at the beginning of class. So then you know that you can participate later as well.
Standing is better.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think so too.
Especially no mic.
So, what Carlo just read took me back, particularly the last paragraph of that chapter, the refrain of what's the matter with college kids these days, and it's I don't know how many of you have seen Bye Bye Birdie. There's a Paul Lind number. What's the matter with kids these days? And but it's not really a question. It's a rant. It's not supposed to have an answer. But for Carlo, it's really a question. And it's a constructive question. Not that there's necessarily anything the matter with kids, but it's how can we leave them better than we found them? Which might seem like a common sense approach to teaching, but it's actually a very subversive approach to college teaching, because it's not about us, that is, the professors. Carlo's book models what we call student-centered education. Even the title, what can I get out of this? The I is a student. In my experience, living in college and university communities, teaching college for a few decades, what can I get out of this is usually the professor. And if students can come along for a ride in the sidecar, that's great. And a lot of the time they do, and they get a lot out of it. That was certainly my experience in college. I got a lot out of it, but I didn't have the sense that people were looking out for me or the experience that I was having. So this Carlo's focus on student-centered education is, I think, for obvious reasons. We're in a shitstorm here. It's needed, but it's balanced on a couple of very sturdy legs, I think. One of them is the idea of skills. So skills are something, particularly if you're a humanist, you don't want to think of yourself as teaching skills. You're teaching content. Content. That's the great thing. I'm a literary historian. I'm not teaching people how to do history. I'm doing literary history, and if people learn to be a historian by watching me, that's really good. They should, but the content is where it's at, and skills are just the wheels on content's chariot. There's a lot of insecurity about teaching skills, particularly if you're a humanist. It's an insecurity, I think, that humanists in particular have to get rid of, not only because skills are really at the center of what we do. If you ask humanists what's the important part of what are the important humanities, humanities values, close reading is going to be one of them. But also, skills are what the students want from us. And if we want the experience to be meaningful, we need to think about what it is that they're coming to the experience for, and how can we make a serious encounter with the humanities into an encounter that the students themselves are also going to benefit from on their own terms, in a way that they'll be able to appreciate, that they have tools that they can take away that they now know they possess. The other sturdy leg that Carlo's method balances on is process. That this teaching experience that he's describing, process. we do it. We do things over and over so we can learn how to do them. And that's the emphasis is on interpretation and discussion, but of course the writing is also what's going on there too. And in the age of AI, I think this has always been true, I think, but in the age of AI, the only way to teach writing is through an emphasis on process. That, I don't know about you, but I was in a lot of classes in college that had a paper due at the end, and that was just the way it was. You were supposed to turn that in at the end, and what you were doing up to that point was really up to you. And that was a way of measuring product, not process. If we are going to leave our students better than we find them, then humanists anyway are going to have to focus more on process than we do, even though that means getting under the hood and sometimes getting dirty. So the last paragraph of the chapter that Carlo was reading from ends with the idea that if you do these things, in this case helping students to participate, join the commune, it makes a class better for everyone in the room, including the teacher. So that's, I think, a nifty takeaway. Carlo doesn't preach, but neither do the best preachers. They tell stories. The preaching, I mean, that is preaching, but it's not in the didactic sense. This book tells a story with a purpose. Beneath its amiability, it's a rescue manual for the humanities. And that makes it a book that we all need to read.
Thank you for those comments, Lenny. They take most of my comments, so I'm gonna remix. I feel like this
It's
is
important to go first.
Yeah, right. Smart experience. This book is like a very special and a precious one, right? So books are not quite a dime a dozen, because if you've had to buy books, you know that's not the price. But there are a lot of books that talk about education. As someone who studies education, even when I agreed to this panel, I was like, okay, it's a book on ed, so fine, right? But when I read it, it literally transported me back to my own educational journey, right? As Eric and as other folks have said, this takes you inside of a college classroom, which is a space that is more and more rare, right? It's a rarefied space. And this book took me back to my freshman year of high school, actually. I was fortunate in many ways and unfortunate in other ways to attend a small private school, right? And I've grown up and felt like I was in a classroom where I was often the smartest kid, and I was pushed, and I got bumped into this school, and it's like an old money school, like founded in 1660. I can remember being in my freshman English seminar, the first period of my freshman year, and I was in this long, narrow room, and there was a fireplace, and there was a portrait of some very old and long dead white man, and we were sitting and we were going around and we were introducing ourselves, and I immediately thought, like, why am I here? Like, who had my name, who ended up in this place, and I'm certainly not supposed to be here. And it turned out that the teacher for the day was running a couple minutes late, and he came running into the room, and I remember it so vividly, and he said, hello, nice to meet you, I know you're all freshmen, my name is Billy Ray Johnson Gonzalez. And I was in New Haven, Connecticut, and I was like, what kind of name is Billy Ray Johnson Gonzalez, right? It felt like all these things smashed together at once. And he was like, let me put it out there, right? I'm from Texas, but I'm Chicano, and I'm gay. And I was like, okay, still doesn't help me, right? But it was during that class that Billy Ray Johnson Gonzalez introduced me to literature. And when people ask me, why did you become a sociologist? I usually tell them The House on Mongo Street by Sandra Cisneros. Right? It was that book that opened up a world, a way of thinking about a world I lived in, and seeing parallels to spaces I had never been, and really helped me understand that you can think about the human condition in just a multitude of ways. And this book captures that. Now, my one concern in this political moment is that this beautiful time capsule will become an artifact. That it is going to be precisely the kind of classroom that we dream about, that some of us have been privileged to experience, but fewer and fewer people gain access to. And for no other reason, I hope that people read this book and it brings them pause. When Eric introduced me, he said, he's a member of the Department of Applied Statistics, Social Science, and Humanities. None of you remember that, correct? It matters though, because I'm in an interdisciplinary, in a multidisciplinary department. And I read this book and I realized and I remembered that I'm keenly aware that the final humanists in our department retired last year. So when I speak to my colleagues about what's the future direction of the department, I think about the loss of humanities not in a global sense, but in a very local sense. And oftentimes their reticence and their hesitancy to say, we need philosophers, we need people who think about literature, we need people who dive into history. Because I don't think you can seriously think about education. I don't think you can think about this world around us without crossing those disciplines in provocative ways. And so he does this in this book by starting with a place of addressing skepticism. So much of the work that we do around education is often built very loosely around empirical research, but very heavily in our assumptions. As you all mentioned, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten forwarded the article about the college students who don't read books. Right? And I'm like, I'm sure they exist. But one of the things I find day in and day out is that I'm speaking to students and meeting students who are wrestling with the world, but have not been invited into the conversation in generous and kind ways like Carlo does in his classroom. Seeing him talk about how these students navigate anxiety, navigate coming to a place like BC, and finding and creating community, and even the extensions that he makes as an educator, it's uncommon, but it's not unheard of. I think about kids who get exposed to places like Carleton College, places like Amherst, and I would love to say often NYU, but I'd be lying to you if I told you that's a freshman experience, right? But I think we have a unique opportunity to learn from these things. First, this book reminds me to ask the question of, can we actually multiply spaces like this? Spaces that center an understanding of human understanding, but also come back to this larger question, not simply of teaching skills, but teaching the question of moving from how do I get out of this, as the book says, to what can I get out of this, right? I love how, as I read this text, I kept on coming back to, and he illustrated how these students were like, my life is separate from this class, but this class gives me tools to deal with my life. Too often, we are increasingly crushed into answering what is it that we're delivering to students that has a payoff, right? Whether it's me rewriting my syllabus every year to match the template and to match the standards of these are the learning outcomes, right? Process is not an outcome that people value, but I think it's one of the most magical and beautiful things about a collegiate education. As we're pushed into places of more narrowness, while more administrators are trying to figure out how to have more students get degrees with fewer hours on campus, right? The way that this book teaches you to languish, the reminder that college is often the last place that you'll wrestle with literature, because when you go out into the world, books are not common. I love this because it teaches us in this political moment where people are trying to shrink the possibility. When the University of Texas is literally attempting to eliminate ethnic studies, black studies, Chicano studies, this book says the only way for us to actually meet our students is to bring us the best of these traditions, to read Junot Diaz, to read across the curriculum. And I hope that whoever reads this book recognizes that the college classroom, while it is a rare space, it's one that deserves to be multiplied. And if we're not careful, soon enough the very thing that made it its own beautiful flower will be decimated. So I hope you'll help me in making sure that this is not an artifact, and it's actually a door and a portal to more possibility.
I was going to do that, but I think you got some more you want to say.
I don't have a massive response to this. I just want to say that I appreciate what both of you had to say. I really take your point about whether this is an artifact, and you know, there's all kinds of things about this that are made possible by how much money Boston College has. The fact that there's few enough people in the room that we can have a conversation, right? But you know, high school classes are about that size, right? Including public high school classes are about that size. And then the other thing I wanted to say was that whether it's an artifact, it's also it's a pre-AI artifact, right? There's one paragraph at the beginning which says this is not a book about AI, right? But I think that one of the interesting things that happened was that over the spring and summer, thanks in part to my former student James Walsh, a lot of humanists read these well-circulated articles about everybody cheating and thought about their teaching a lot. And it's turned into an odd moment for the humanities, right? Like, this is your class where you get to be a human being and talk to other humans, and they know your name, and we try to figure things out. And as you know, as you pointed out, and as Lenny also pointed out, I don't teach a content. I just teach a way of coming at things. And what we do is we just practice that way of coming at things for 15 weeks, and the students can bring whatever their interests are to that. So it turns out this is an odd moment when at least some people think, like, actually, I want to have some classes like that. So I ask my students to turn off spell check when they're, not only not to use ChatGPT, but not to use spell check, not to use grammar check, not to use anything when they write, And they come back and they're like, wow, it was intense. I was so naked, And it's like, yeah, it's your freaking class where people know my name when we write naked, and that turns out to be, in this moment, like, what are you paying for in a humanities class? You're paying for two things. You're paying for the admissions policy, and you're paying for the hiring and promotion policy that produce the other people in the room. And you can do everything else at home in your underwear, right? You can read books, you can have opinions on the internet, everybody else does, right? But what you can't do is be in a room for 75 minutes at a time with a bunch of other people who are undistracted and have all read the same thing and are trying to get a meaning out of it. And in this moment, that actually turns out to be a thing that at least some people are willing to pay. Who knew? So should we have a conversation?
Move on to the next stage. Before we open up to questions, just one question for me, Carlo. Have you invited the students in this book back to Stokes 209 to read the text and discuss together?
I have. So that's an excellent idea. I was thinking for some of the stops on the book, from the book event stops, some of them live in those places. I could invite those. Not everyone wants to get up there with me. So, like, I was Emily.
Any former students in the room?
Not from this class.
Okay.
Not from this class.
Better that way. Okay, so you can.
What happened to those two?
Huh?
What happened to the two that you just read about?
As far as I know, Colleen is a special ed teacher that worked out, and I have lost track of Kathy. I have to figure out what's going on. She had a number of plans running from jewelry designer to finance capital. So somewhere in there is.
Wow. I would love to see you bring the book back to Stokes 209 conversation. I think they'd be pretty excited about it. Have you sent them the book?
I did write to everyone and say, you get, I will send you a copy if you send me your address. So I got back into touch with more of them because people were like, free book.
Yeah. Free book about me. We made a point of trying to invite some people from the NYU first year seminar program, right? Anyone here from the NYU faculty in those programs? Well, we're not inviting them again. All right, the floor is open. Jump in. Yes.
Why do you call them skeptics? Because it would seem this is a class that everybody has to take, so you would come in sort of like indifferent, So.
Oh, I would say, no, they come in skeptical. They come in skeptical not about the value of education, but about the work of interpreting things. Even though we all go around doing it all the time. As soon as an English teacher says, we're going to interpret this book, and oddly, poetry gets a pass. People accept that poetry requires interpretation, maybe because it's not so plotty, right? It's not so many words. But there was a very high level of skepticism about two things, about the actual work of interpreting things, that it was not just magic or we weren't just making it up, and then about what it would get them later in life, like how it would, there was no job called English. Right? Just like the worst argument. Only in America would people be like, that's a shrewd point. I like to say to them, well, the last three governors in Massachusetts were all English majors, even Mitt Romney. So apparently there's a job you can get with a degree, which is governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
But if you major in governor's studies, it should be better.
Only one, Maura Healy. She's the only one. The other before them were classics and American studies. So I think there was a high degree of skepticism about, if we're going to be forced to do this, what's going to be the value to me? And in the age of AI, that's exactly required class, a fairly large required class that people feel they don't need to take is exactly the highest candidate for like what the hell I just dumped this prompt in ChatGPT, right? Because it's like, well, why? What's the use of it? So I guess I feel like what that does is that makes the first job of work in the class to be, this is the craft, this is what you use this craft for, this is how you do it. It's, you know, you can do it better or worse. There are stronger and weaker arguments. We're going to make strong arguments in here. In your life, you're going to need to make strong arguments.
Carlo, what could you give your rap that you give your students on AI?
No, because it'll take too long.
Could you give us the headline?
So I did give it at the beginning of this semester, and it was, I have to say it was pretty good. I thought it was pretty good. And when I was done, you know that like earnest, ironic, steady gaze of the young that they give you? And they were all like, looked like you enjoyed getting that off your chest, Gramps. That's the third AI talk I've heard today. So.
There's a good one on YouTube by Philip Nell, N-E-L.
Yeah.
He teaches in Kansas, and it's a lively little 8-minute video that has, I think, 9 reasons why you shouldn't use AI, and he's amusing.
I mean, part of it is, you know, like, okay, you're paying $5 a minute for class at BC. I figured it out, it's $5 a minute. So you're paying $5 a minute, and you can either use that time to practice being replaceable by AI, or actually get good at something, right? And, you know, my argument is like, well, you know, it's not a factory, it's a workshop, right? So class should feel like being in a band or being on a team. Like, we're all working on our individual jobs, we're doing this thing together. And, I mean, we've had machines for hundreds of years that can move faster than people and can lift more weight, but if you want to get faster, and you want to get stronger, you need to lift the weight yourself, and you need to run the miles yourself. And it's, you know, like, the point of the gym is not for the weights to go up and down, it's for you to move them, you know? And so, I don't ban it in my class, because I hate making rules I can't enforce, but I say, like, you know, if you want to do it right, turn everything off and do the spell check. This is your one chance to actually get better at doing this kind of stuff. Among other things, get better at fielding the avalanche of AI-generated crap coming at you and figuring out how it works and what meaning is and, you know, what's reliable and what's not. And, you know, it's, you know, neuroscientists, their big thing is use it or lose it, right? Like, you know, when you're reading, there's such an amazing amount of stuff going on when you're reading. You're like making predictions and anticipating and judging what the letters you're reading now in relation to the other letters in the word and the content of what you read so far in relation to what you read before. And if you don't do it, have you seen Wall-E? You become like the humans in Wall-E. You know, you're just a blob, you know, and it's like, do whatever you want. And the thing about BC is you can just add like, but if you don't do it my way, you're a punk ass bitch. All right. Like, okay, he's a professor, he's old, he said. So it tends to work. Mr. Esposito.
Yes, I've slowly been turning into one of those blob people from Wall-E over the past years since I've been out of your class.
What was the class you took and when did you take it?
I was in the City and Literature and Film, and then I think one American Studies class. This is like 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago.
But you went back for a second course.
Oh yeah, no, I loved it. City and Literature and Film was fantastic. Saw this morning. No, anyway, the question that I want to ask is in regards to this interpretive work that we're doing with students. I wonder, like, when you have students who are going into this vulnerable place, like these two girls we talked about, who, you know, making themselves feel very vulnerable to share what is their interpretation. How do you, if at all, kind of address like relative quality of interpretation? You know, because that was something that I would come up against. Is kind of the fine line between trying to push. Can you go a little deeper with that?
Yeah.
And making somebody feel like I did it wrong, and then they shut down.
Yeah. So I mean, I love stuff like that because that's all craft, right?
Yes.
And it's taken me forever to get better at that. You know, just asking questions, making if-then statements is a big one. So I guess part of it is that it's actually pretty rare that one person in a classroom comes up with a full-blown interpretation of something, right? So I try to, at the beginning, lower the bar way down, just have like a noticing exercise. Let's notice form and whatever, however we see it. And then like, let's start putting these together. And I start making if-then statements. If what Dan says is true, and then what Becky said was true, and you know, and what Shane said was true, then if we put those three things together, it seems like we got an interpretation of the whole water. But then what are we going to do about chapter 2, which seems to say the opposite, right? So they sort of gather up and get a new problem. And part of what you're modeling is just we're encountering problems, we're trying to solve them. If we can't, we back up and go around. We're not paralyzed. We're not, we don't give up.
Teaching collaboration too.
Yeah, and teaching collaboration, but also class is your opportunity to just do bits and pieces of it. Then when you write a paper, you got to do it all, right? But class is your opportunity to just play a couple notes. Like I think of my job as like playing crunchily inviting rhythm guitar, right? And then like, who wants to play like an altered scale would sound good over this? Dan, and it's like just try a couple notes, just see how it sounds, right? And that's part of it, because they have this idea that I think is behind the question, which is like, I'm going to go to English class and I'm going to have this full-blown interpretation of the symbolism and that's just not how it works. We're just putting together Legos, right? Like, okay, first we dump them all the Legos on the table. Let's everybody notice stuff. Okay, let's just put together 2 Legos, now 3.
But surely there are moments, even in doing it in these limited, I'm just going to take a little bite, where somebody says, well, I think that tree represents her mother, and you as the teacher are sitting there saying, no, not
so. It depends where we are in the semester. Like, if we're deep in the semester, we've had the conversation about, how you get that feeling that you're like cantilevered way out over an abyss, and there's no evidence. Like, are we getting that feeling? Like you can be a little funny about it, But especially early in the semester, I think it's more like, okay, where would we find, we're going to need some more evidence for that.
Yeah.
Where would we find it without then having the whole class turn into a hunt for that evidence, right? So, I have to balance that. I think sort of forward momentum with what am I trying to model? What I'm trying to model is if it sounds pretty out there, let's go find some more evidence. Right?
So, hi there, my name is Trace Jordan. I'm a teacher here at NYU. I have taught seminar classes, usually with a smaller group of students, around 20. 30 sounds like a lot.
33.
33, okay. Oh. Okay. One thing I really liked is your description of the classroom as a black box that not many people get to peer inside. So where I see your book really as being a kind of ethnography of the classroom. So let me share my ethnographic observation and see if you encountered something similar. Maybe you have a solution for it that I haven't yet found. When I teach, I feel like I am the hub of the wheel, and the spokes go out to the students. And students, I'm pretty good at engaging with students, and they're pretty good at engaging with me. But it's a wheel that has no connection between
it's like public
the
transportation in
spokes.
Boston.
And as try as I might, I can't get students to get the idea, like the lateral learning, that what other people in the class have to say can be as valuable, if not sometimes more so than what I have to say. So that is something I've struggled with, and I wonder if you have encountered that too. How have you dealt with it?
I think about that one a lot, and some of it is just training myself to not always respond. Like I'm in 53rd grade, right? So I can take, I don't know how, 6 minutes of silence in class, and students will break before me. So one of the things I do is like if somebody says something good, I'll just look at the students. And then the other thing is just bear the device, which is what I always do. I will just say like, okay, it's October, we know each other, we trust each other, it's no longer public speaking, we should be talking to each other. And then I'll do a little prompting, like, did you hear what she just said? How come nobody's writing that down? Now, watch this. I'm going to repeat what she just said, and people are going to write it down. Like, why are we? That's ridiculous, So just sort of that kind of stuff. But a lot of it is that sort of dispassionate era of this is how this is properly done. Like, okay, in September it was okay to everybody talk to me, and I talk to everybody. Now it's October, so if we're going to be pros about it, the next step is we need to be talking to each other, Another thing that I do is before we have a conversation in class, first we have a conversation about what we're going to talk about. And I write all that on the board, and I have my back to it. So my rule is, it's sort of like going to a dinner party, like about every 15 to 18 minutes, you talk to this person, you turn and talk to this person, right? So about every 15 to 18 minutes, we'll have gotten all the juice out of one of the items on the board. You can see the board and I can't. So somebody's going to have to move us gracefully to the next item, and it's not going to be me, right? So just in all those ways, saying my objective is to make myself expendable by December. So you need to step up and start responding to each other, preparing to teach, and doing all those things as we move. And again, just bearing that device right at the beginning.
I'm going to set the questions at the beginning, and then as we move through the semester, setting the questions is going to become a group activity. Right? And just more and more, it's like there should be no mystery about what we're doing. There can be mystery in the literature, but there should be no mystery about what we're doing or why. Right?
Remember you made this point about the disappearance of humanities in your department. Is your concern that here at NYU, this in the school, have forgotten about what happened in the classroom like this? How did it fall off the agenda? Where does it stand?
Yeah, no, I think it is kind of, NYU is emblematic of a lot of institutions of higher education, even though we have a lot more. You know, I tend to describe NYU as a real estate empire with an educational habit, right? Which means at the end of the day, you've got to account for your space and prove its value. And a lot of my colleagues who have been in the humanities for years, who helped actually form this misfit department, as they continue to age and teach courses, other things became sexier, right? So we have a brand new sparkling PhD in computational social science, right? So folks who are interested in large language models and inequality interventions, they can come in and get a PhD fully funded. But if you were someone who studies the history of education, right, that program is now dormant, because our historians who were explaining the direction, the whittling down of the value of education to kind of like this more technocratic enterprise, either got ignored or were told, yes, that's true, but this is not going to draw people here, because people were able to post ads within an algorithm that says, come get this PhD in computational social science, very sexy, come learn to talk about the world around you and why we need to rethink education, much less sexy, right? There's a way in which the move towards marketing has also driven the direction of our department, but you see that all across the board, right? You see it in Florida, you see it in Texas, you see it in the Northeast, where people are saying, yes, there are certain schools that get to remain these rarefied spaces, but if most students will never have a specialized classroom, what does community college look like? And my answer is often, community colleges can do some of the greatest work around these smaller interventions in education, but it's like, what's the practical outcome? And so I think we're all figuring out not just what happens with the humanities, but for me, what the value of education is and why we've continued to shrink it and believe that it only has limited function.
And I think it probably matters that Lenny and I teach at Jesuit institutions where Catholicism is useless to me in every other way, but it's useful in this way, which is that nobody questions the centrality of the humanities to the mission of the university. That's part of what the university is for. It's just an overgrown liberal arts college. So it's never going to be that sort of like, well, what's the ROI, and that kind of super literal-minded and not analytically sound way, you know, which is how is this major leading to this job, which it almost never works that way in the world.
I mean, I'll say, I think the humanities have always been a strength of NYU, and the institution is so heavily invested in it, but in some schools, you can see that disappearing. Okay, we have time for this. Let's take the three hands. We're going to do them together. And then, Carlo, we're going to give you a chance to take us out, because we want to leave enough time for Carlo to sign some books. Let's go 1, 2, 3.
Hi, my name is Shalene Nguyen. I'm an NYU Wagner adjunct. My first semester of last year. So thank you so much. This has been very insightful, and I appreciate it. You spoke a lot about teacher-to-student engagement. I teach an almost 3-hour class, and so I break it up with peer-to-peer learning. And you also spoke about assignments and group assignments, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about peer-to-peer activities during the classroom. What do you look for? What's important? And about quality control. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'll remember that.
Okay, thank you.
You won't sign any books if we do it that way.
I kind of had a follow-up question to what you were just talking about. I think a lot of us have had the experience with the 2 students you mentioned of trying to figure out like problem solving, why they're not speaking in class or how to get them engaged. But like that flavor feels very different for me. For example, uptown Lehman, where I teach, where it's just the kinds of reasons are different. A student might have come here 6 months ago from Central America, and you're negotiating something very different. So I guess a question I have is, you're clearly you're grappling with a generational or like epochal question, but how much of your answer is like very BC flavored, and how much is actually scalable beyond your classroom at BC?
Last one.
Sorry, but so I'm probably the oldest of your alumni here. I had Carlo 30 years ago, and am now a professor of food studies at NYU and your competitor Boston University. So quick two-part question. One, was there any particular text that you taught in this class or other ones that really provoked an unexpected response in communication and that idea in food studies, you know, Coleman's style of like bringing everything together? And two, do you still teach the 1981 horror film Wolfen in your American studies class?
I still teach Wolfen sometimes in the city class because it's such a great example of redevelopment from a horror movie. Yeah. He makes a great pair with Chinatown, actually, both about redevelopment. As is The Rise of Silas Lapham.
Both are horror.
Let's see, we'll go backwards. Sorry, wait, what was the question part?
Is there any text
Oh,
that
so
provoked
the short version of that is I like to teach a very strange thing, a very strange text about 1/3 of the way into the semester as a kind of like bonding exercise and like group midterm. And in this class, it was one I often teach, but one of my favorite writers, Stuart Dybek, Chicago writer, it's called Visions of Bud Harden. It's about a guy who goes back to his old neighborhood in an elephant suit. Kind of a mechanical elephant suit, but he's also kind of an elephant. And even 5 years later, the students are like, that fucking elephant. And not only that, but they're like, you know, I had to go to a reunion, and I kind of felt like I was in an elephant suit, you know, like that. So you teach something where like, it can't just be an elephant, right? Like, we have to interpret this. And you, as a professor, can sort of be like, what are we going to do? You know? And then they're like, well, nobody leave. We'll figure it out, right? So that's sort of, teach something that just absolutely demands to be interpreted. And so for me, the Visions of Bud Harden come to you. I think my answer to you would be, I think you just start with who's in the room. So they happen to be BC students, and they happen to have a set of concerns that are typical of BC students, but I feel like I don't teach a content. I just, as I said, teach a way of coming at things, and I start with who's in the room, what would they like to be able to do. Maybe I'll give them some new things to aspire to be able to do, but I start there. And by the way, I think that's also insurance against getting old as a professor. You know, if you're still teaching, like, why are we in Vietnam? You know, it's like, not in Vietnam. But if you're saying, like, here's how I come at things, and then you bring your content to it. So I would start with just who's in the room, what are their concerns. And they're going to be different, obviously, at Lehman than they are at BC, but they were also different in the group there. There was a minority of students in my class whose attitude was, I don't come from money, and everybody else in the room does. And they couldn't recognize each other, right? Because their camouflage was so good. So that was a group that I had to think about, and it's like, you know, and Colleen was one of them, right? Small group. So I am no small group virtuoso. I do it a little bit, but you know, and what I'll say is just like everything else in this book, stunningly obvious, which is when I do it, it's like we have to have an absolutely clear objective, and you know, like time limit, clear objective, and clear roles for everybody in the group, right? But I tend not to do it. I tend to default to we're all in, you know, we're in this group together. We met. It's like it should feel like a family. Like, what are we going to do about Uncle Bob? You know, that's what class should feel like. You know, feel like, I have an idea. You know, it should feel a little bit like that. And I'm not a big break it down. I do think that it's very important. One thing that students said a lot that I try to keep in mind is that in a literature class, students may get their tools from the professor, but they get their actual interpretations of the text from other students. So, you know, they hear other people have ideas and they say, oh, well, maybe there is a way to deal with this difficult elephant thing, right? So one of the things I try to do is, as much as possible, not only have the students produce the ideas, but make them the owners of the ideas. So like 20 minutes, 30 minutes after Shane has made a point to say like, well, if we're going to go back to Shane's point about that, you know, and just like make them the theorists, so that you're modeling the sort of building something out of bits and pieces that we've all created.
Well, if you're like me, what you've been thinking these last 90 minutes is, I really wish I could take a course, be in a classroom with Carlo Rotella. And the answer is you can't. Unless you enroll at Boston College, where you pay $5 a minute for every class, not just his.
That's
There's
improv.
a far less expensive solution to this problem, which is to go out and get a copy of his book, which really does take you into his classroom in a deep and profound way. And I'll tell you, for those of you who come to IBK, often you know, typically when we have discussants after speaker, they are full of tough, critical questions and raise all kinds of concerns. And we didn't cherry pick the speakers tonight because we knew in advance that they would love this. They just love it because it really is an extraordinary book. So, Carlo, thank you for
Thank you,
writing
Larry.
it.